Ezras Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Menachos Daf Ayin number 70, and we will begin. Ezras Hashem on Daf Samach Tes Omid Beis by Reb Shimon ben Pazi. So here we go. Daf Samach Tes Omid Beis 69b by Reb Shimon ben Pazi towards the end there. So. By Reb Shimon ben Pazi. Now we know that the Oimer, the Minchas HaOimer, was matir for a person to eat chodesh, new grains, right? So now the Reb Shimon ben Pazi had a question. She boilish a stalk of wheat. Shavir shlish kaidem Oimer. Va'akara. Let's say you have this picture over here. A stalk of wheat that didn't grow to its full length. It grew about a third what it's supposed to grow. And then it got uprooted. Okay. Now, Ushasala, and then the Oimer, they were makar of the Oimer in the base of Migdash. Ushasala la'achara Oimer, and they replanted it after the Oimer. V'haisifa, and it grew. So somebody came, and what did he do? He replanted the Oimer. So he just he uprooted it. He uprooted the stalks of grain. The Oimer was makriv, and then he replanted it, and it grew again. So now, is this plant permitted to eat? Mahu. The question is, basa ikar azlinim. Do we grow when the first part of the plant grew? Usharye Oimer, and the Oimer was materit, right? Oy dilmo, do maybe since you replanted it again. We go after what was increased, the additional part of the plant, which it grew another 2/3, and it's not permitted to eat until the next oimer is brought as an offering. So the question is basar ikar or basar tosefes. So the Gemara says tifshet le maha. I could prove it an answer from the following statement. The Omer Abavo, Omer Rab Yochanan said Yalda. Let's say you have a grapevine. Let's get the grapevine up. And you see on top over here on the picture, you have a grapevine of Arla, okay? So you can't eat these grapes, right? They were a grapevine that was under 3 years old. But you grafted it to an old vine. And now the grapes started to grow. And so now, if it grew into a huge size grape, can you eat it now? So the answer is no, because it'll always go after the ikar. You always go as where it grew initially. So there's your answer. You always you always determine something where it grew initially. Let's say you have a young vine that was grafted onto an old vine and it had fruits of arla, even if it grew to a tremendous grape, asar, it's always asar, because we go after how it was initially. Initially, it was an arla grape. And another thing Reb Shmuel was saying in the name of Yerechanan, Batzel, take an onion, that you planted it next to a vineyard. So now that onion, which you planted on the ground, if you've seen onions being planted on the ground, becomes asr like klayim. It's not supposed to be planted next to a vine. Then v'nekar hakerem, and then the kerem got uprooted. Afila hoyse b'masayim, even if the onion grew another 200, asr remains asr. So you see from both of these statements, you go after what happened initially. So then, to determine the question of the oimer situation, we're going to go where it grew initially. It grew initially before the first oimer, and therefore, before you replanted it, we already had the oimer that was materit. So who cares if you replanted it again? So the Gemara says that's not true. He gufo kama ba'ilah. That is my question. Is it true that the rabbis have the answer that you always go after, you always determine something after where it was grown initially? So it doesn't matter if you're going light, if you're going lenient or strict. You always your answer, your question is, where was the initial growth of this plant? Maybe It's a suffix. So l'chumra amrinim, l'kula lo amrina. I'm not going to say l'kula. In other words, when you want to say that this plant is permitted, you're going l'kula, because basically saying, what was the case? This shiboilas, this piece of wheat that was subsequently pulled out of the ground, the oimer happened, and then you replanted it, and it grew another 2/3. So you're going to say that, oh, the oimer was moderate, so as soon as you pull it out of the ground, you could eat it. That's a kula. A kula to say that you go after where it initially grew, at the time period it initially grew. Maybe you only go after ikar when it's going strict, like the case of the kalayim, but not over here, or the case of the orla. Teku, the Gemara remains unresolved. Boya Rabba had a question. In your mind, Meiser mind. When it comes to Meiser, do you go after ikar or toisvis, where it initially grew? For example, hey Chidami, what's the case? Kagoy, you take a piece of wheat that grew a bunch of wheat, right? The amduhu, let's say you have a pile of wheat, right? That the amduhu, that they made an estimation, right? And you don't know exactly what 10% is because it's in its flour, the kernel of wheat, but you estimated v'loy asrinu, you were meiser on it. But then you took the pieces of wheat, and you replanted it in the ground, and it grew further. Now, the question is, the ikar, you took meiser off. The toisvis, whatever is grew extra, you didn't take meiser. So would you say that since you're going to have to give meiser on the toisvis, you also have to re-give meiser on the ikar? That's the question. You don't go after the ikar. So the toisvis boya asuri, and you're going to have to take off. You're going to have to take off meiser of whatever grew extra. So if you replanted it in the ground, right? You took off meiser right before you replanted it. Then it grew another 2/3, you're going to have to give off meiser again for the 2/3. So are you going to have to give off meiser again on the initial? The question is, ikar mai, what would you have to retake meiser on the initial one? Amalei, Abayas said, Maishna, why is that any different? Maishna, why is that any different than any case when you plant a seed in the ground? Hold on. Maishna, why is that any different? Okay, I have to reset this. Hold on. Okay, hold on. I have to close this and reopen it again. Hold on. Maishna, but what Abai is going to say is, why is this any different than any time when you replant something in the ground, you replant a meiser seed in the ground, right? So Maishna, mikol chiti v'sar dalma, you take a piece of wheat or a grain, a kernel of barley, you plant it in the ground, and then whatever grows out, you have to give off meiserus, right? So even though you initially gave meiserus on the piece of wheat prior to you planting it, but when you replant it, you have to give off meiserus again. Amalei, so Rava answered Abaya, my question is different. I have no question when the seed is destroyed, when you put it into the ground, it's totally lost. Certainly you have to give off meiser, again, for whatever grows. My question is, by something which doesn't get destroyed, as you see in the picture. You're just replanting something into the ground. So that's my question. What would be the din? Do you have to take off meiserus from the ikar? So the Gemara says, Tishlei Maha, I could answer you from here. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, litra batzel. You have a box, let's say, full of onions. Shetiknu, that you took off meiserus of it. So now a box of onions that's kosher to eat. Uzroi, but you planted it. Masasa lefi kula, and you put it in the ground. You have to retake off meiser on the whole thing. If you pull the onions back out of the ground, and then they're now larger onions, and they're not destroyed, the original is still existent, you have to retake off meiserus on the entire onion. So the Gemara says no, but Hasim Hainis Riyose, that's the normal way to plant onions. Hacha over here, Lav Hainis Riyose, that's not the normal way to plant wheat. No one plants wheat like, a flower pot over here, like he's doing in the picture. So it could be that you don't have to take off Maestris again on the initial. Another question. Otzus Sheina Nokov. Otzus Sheina Nokov. You have a flower pot that has no perforations, right? Mahu. What's the din? Now, if you're taking off, let's say you have two flower pots, each one growing wheat, and they both are not perforated, so then you could take off meisers from one on the other. It's not a problem, because a flower pot that's not connected, perforated, is really not considered midaraisa, connected to the ground. So it's only chayav meisers midrabanan. So here's this question. Is a flower pot that has no hole in it. Mahu, what's the din? Eloi nokev, holei nokev. If it doesn't have a hole in it, it's not chayav in meisers midaraisa. What is your question? Dilma chazav in a cover comer. But maybe Abaya, your question is if you make a hole in it. So let's say you have two flower pots and each one is growing wheat, and you took off meisers from one of the flower pots, right? And now, so it's only meisers midrabanan you took off. And now you made holes on the bottom of the flower pot. Hacha over here. So now, do you have to take off meisers again if something else grows? Hacha over here, chada zriyahi, ichbure hudav chabre v'oila. Since it's one planting, so it's very different than. So Gemara thought it was like Rava's question, but it's really different. Rava's question, it's two different plantings. First, you uproot it. Then you took off meisers, and then you replanted it again. So it's two plantings. Perhaps the second time, when you cut it and finally it grew, you would have to take off meisers. But here, it's in the same pot. It's the same planting. You didn't have to. So it should work. Hasam over there, it's two different plantings. So over there, you could have a question. Maybe over here, you don't have to take off meisers again. Another question. Rababo asked the question. Let's say you have a stack of wheat that was piled smoothly, and now it's chayev and meisers midaraisa, right? You smooth out a big pile of ready processed wheat. Ushasol, and then you replanted it. You planted it in the ground. And then after it's planted into the ground, you called it truma or meisers. So you replanted something and say, oh, this is meisers. Mao. Does it work? Kivin the marcha tavlula. Since you already finished the process, so now it's tevel. So kikara lashem. So even after you replant it again and you call it meisers, kachela, it's holy. Oidilma, no. Kivin the shasala, since you replanted it, now you want to call it truma or meisers, pakale tivla mimei. It's not tevel anymore. It's planted. It's connected to the ground. So therefore, it shouldn't work. Amr le Rabbanan la Abaya. Rabbanan Abaya says, Imkain, if it could work, that means you replant something into the ground, and now you're going to call it truma or meisers. Imkain, if that's the case, matzino, truma b'mechubel karka. Then you'll have something that's called truma, and it's connected to the ground. Utnan, we learned in the Mishnah, loy metzrinu truma b'mechubel karka. We never find truma that's connected to the ground. Amalei. So Rabbi said, he tanya and that Bryce is talking about le'inyan achuva misa v'choimish. When it's connected to the ground, it's really truma when it's connected to the ground. However, if someone would eat it, he's not chayiv misa. If someone eats it by mistake, he's not chayiv to give 20% more. Di talish v'achal. If he uproots it and eats it, talishu. If he eats it, then he gets an avera because he just ate truma. But if he eats it while it's still connected to the ground, nobody eats this way, and that's not called it eating. But truth be told, it's called truma while it's connected to the ground. That's not the problem. The problem is if you eat it while still connected to the ground, you don't get the avera of eating truma. Says the Gemara, just because something connected, that's not the way to eat. Ma'ishno, what is that different? The cost of Ampinkase the Ilfa. It was written on the notebook of Ilfa, Beit say Nivlais Oif Tar. Let's say you have a kosher bird that has eggs inside of it. Okay, a kosher duck that has eggs. Some of the eggs are outside the body of the duck. And sometimes some of them were still in the dead carcass of the duck. So mibifnim, if you eat the eggs that are inside the duck, so it's like eating a dead nevelas of tahar. As soon as you swallow it, you become tame, and you matame your clothing. But if you eat the eggs that were laid already, so people are not. It doesn't betama the begodim on beisabliya. Now, the question is, why do you, if you eat the eggs that are connected to the dead carcass, are you chayev? You told me when something's connected to something, that's not called eating. So why, if you eat the eggs that are in the dead body of this duck, you get tumah? And says the Gemara, Talish avide de enashe de achli hachi, something that it itself is disconnected. It's just inside the animal. It's inside the bird. That's an egg. It's not connected to the bird. It's just inside the bird. So you open up the dead duck and you eat the egg. So avida inshe de achli, a person could eat it that way. But mechubar, when something is connected to the ground, and you're eating it while it's still connected to the ground without cutting it first, people don't eat that way. So that ends this piece of the sugya. Comes the Gemara and says one last thing. You notice that every time the Gemara deals with Zroyim stuff, as soon as it goes into Zroyim stuff, it goes off on the tangents of Zroyim because there was no Gemara written on Zroyim. So it tries to get, to continue the conversation. Look at this picture. A person planted kalayim. So the picture didn't come out so well, but basically he planted in a flower pot wheat and barley. So he has wheat and barley in a flower pot. That's not perforated. Is it permissible to do that? It's not connected to the ground. If you plant kalayim in a flower plot that's not perforated, it's still also to do that. In one flower plot, you can't plant wheat and barley. Amar Abaya said, there's no chiddush for that. Bishlam Yashmin, like you get malchus, Bardis, Midrabanim, Shaper. Then I understand what's the chiddush of Shmuel, that if you do that, you're going to get malchus. The rabbis are going to give you malchus. Ella Osir, my kamashmalon. What's the chiddush to tell me that you're not allowed to do it? The Rabbanan have Isriya, because you're trying to tell me the Rabbanan says if you planted kalayim. Tanina, we learned that. Torah Mishain and Nokav ala Nokav, Truma b'Yachsav Ritron. If you take off Truma from a non-perforated flower pot on a perforated flower pot, you did Truma. So we see it's called planting because it's still Truma, but you have to take off Truma again from the perforated flower pot. So what would be the novelty of Shmuel to say that if you plant kalayim in a non-perforated flower pot, it's Asr? New Mishnah. There are 5 grains that are usher to eat before they bring the oimer. And these are, here it's on the table, wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. Okay, that's what it is. All these things, all these 5 grains, if you make a dough out of them, you're chayav to give off challah. And start from zemzeh. Half kazayas, they can combine each other for the shir challah. You can have a half of a dough made of barley dough and wheat dough. Vasurim b'chodesh, and all these things are not allowed to be eaten before the oimer. Milifnei oimer, they're supposed to be milifnei oimer. You're not allowed to eat it until they bring the oimer. And not only that, milikzar, you're not allowed to even cut it milifnei Pesach, before the yontiv of Pesach. That's that you have to reverse it. Before Pesach, you're not allowed to cut any of the new crops of these 5 grains. The first cutting has to be done, first harvesting of grain has to be done with the barley grain with the barley grain that you're going to bring for the Omer, which is on Matzah, first day of Pesach, first day of night, Chalabai Pesach. Then the Mishnah says, if it took root before the Omer, then the Omer was materit. Vimlav, let's say it took root, let's say on Chalamoid Pesach, after the Omer was brought, Asurin, that crop is Na'asar Achiyovai Ha'omer Abba until next year. Says the Gemara, Tana Kusmim. Kusman, I think, is oats. No, is rye, is spelt. Min chitim, it's type of wheat. Shibai l'shuel v'shifine is means iron. Shibai l'shuel v'shifine is type of oats and rye as type of barley. So really, there's two types: barley and wheat. But what's included in barley is kusman is shbal shu v'shifine is type of barley, and kusman is a type of wheat. Kusman, the Gemara says, we go to Mabez Gulva, Shifa in Dishra, Shibayla Tal. Says the Gemara, Hani, and these are grains and nothing else. Oires V'doiche, and let's say rice and millet, loy, is not considered. So if you make a dough out of rice dough or millet dough or quinoa, is not. How do you know that? How do you know that you're not chayiv and challah if it's made out of another, type of substance that could turn into a dough? Minohani mili. Amar Shlokish, or Shlokish says, Asya lechem lechem mimatzah. It says lechem by the challah, that you're supposed to take off challah, and lechem to make matzah. It says lechem oini. Ksiv hasa v'hoya ba'ach lechem ha'oretz, take off challah. Ksiv lechem oini. So this, like by matzah, has to be made out of the 5 types of grain. So also challah is taken off from a dough that was made of the 5 types of grain. How do you know matzah has to be made of the 5 types of grain? Amar Shlokish, Shlokish says, V'chein tanu b'Reb Shmuel, V'chein tanu Reb Elazar ben Yaakov. Omakra, there's a pasuk that says, Loi soichal olav of chametz, shivas yomim toichal olav matzahs lechem oini. So there's a juxtaposition between the matzah, the poor man's bread, and chametz. So we darshan davar aboim l'deichimet, something that could become to a fermentation process. Adam yaitze yedei chavasa b'pesach. Yaitze, the mitzvah of Pesach, with matzah. So Eli, these things, quinoa or rice or millet, she'ein boil l'dei chimetz, they never become to fermentation. Elul l'dei sirchan, they just decay. So then they don't. There's no mitzvah of they don't. They're not. You cannot make matzah out of them to make the mitzvah of eating matzah. Umitzdarfen zeh zeh. Tana we learned in a brayse. Hatvua. Let's say you have wet wheat, and flour, v'abetzekas in a dough. Mitzdarfen zem zeh. They could mitzdarfen with each other. My hilchasa. What's the halacha? What do you mean they combine with each other? Amar Rav Kahana le'inyan chodesh. Let's say to eat a chodesh, you have to eat a kazayis to be chayiv, to get the malchus of eating chodesh, right? So if you ate a kazayis that was combined, that was made up with wet wheat, flour, and dough, then you get the avera. You could get the avera. Rav Yosef Amar, Rav Yosef says linyan chametz b'Pesach. If you eat a kazayis chametz b'Pesach that was made of wet wheat, flour, and dough, you chayiv. Papa Omalin Maisasheni regarding Maisasheni. The Achol Chutz L'chaim, if you have this, all this was Maisasheni, and they combine it and you ate it outside a kazayas, outside the walls of Yerushalayim, lucky you get Malchus. So Rava says, lenient Tumas Eichel. This matter combines into it being Mekabel Tumas Eichel. In other words, can this food, a normal food, in order to be mekabel, to be susceptible to tumah, it has to be the size of an egg, right? So, but it's these types of, and made out of one type. These things could combine to the size of an egg and be mekabel tumah. Tvua, kamochem, and betzekes. The tvua or kamochem dumya the betzekes, and not only that, it teaches you another idea. That tvu and kamochem has to be edible. In order to be mekabel tumas eichlin, it has to be edible. And what does it mean edible? That means that tvua has to be like edible type of grain. that you could just pop it into your mouth. It doesn't have impurities in it. Ma'hasam, just like the dough, uchla be'ena, you could eat it by itself. Avhochaname, the tvu and the kamacham has to be something that's uchla be'ena, that has no impurities in it, and you can eat it straight away. Says the Gemara, Vohatanya, didn't you learn? We learned in a brisa, chita, wheat, ben klufa, ben shene klufa, mitzdarefes. Whether you peeled the wheat or you didn't peel the wheat, it's mitzdaref. So oira, Vohatanya, that's the brisa. In other words, Vohatanya is a proof to that. A wheat, you can eat it whether it's peeled, whether it's not peeled. It combines. A barley, klufa mitzdarefes, only if the barley has its peeled away, because its shell is not edible. She'eina klufa, but if it's not peeled away, ein mitzdarefes, it's not going to combine. So that says the Gemara. So you're telling me that the barley shell is not edible, and the only way we're going to say a barley wheat could be combined with flour and dough to be an edible food if it's unpeeled. Says the Gemara of Eini, that's not true. In the Brisa, Rabbi Shmuel learned al kol zera zerua asher yizareya kiderach shebnei adam moitzi lizriya, that every seed could be mikabel tuma. Just like a person will find a piece of wheat, chita bekli pasa, a piece of wheat with its shell, usaira bekli pasa, and a piece of barley with its shell, va'adashim bekli pasa, and lentils with its shell, are all combined to be bekabel tuma. So how could you tell me that the barley shell is not edible? And says the Gemara, it depends what barley shell. Like kasha, ha belachis. If it's wet barley shells, it could be, or it's just picked it and it's still not dried out. Yes, then it's edible. Ha beyavashis. But if it's dried out barley shells, then it's not edible, and therefore the only way it's mitzdaref is if it's peeled. One last line of the Gemara: Basurin b'chodesh milfnei ha'omer. They're supposed to be omer. Now that I eat the chodesh until they bring the omer. Menohani mili. How do you know that? Omer shlokish asi lechem lechem mi matzah. We have exer shava lechem from matzah, and therefore it says lechem v'koli v'karmel lo yisaychlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. So just like matzah, and it says lechem oini, so just like matzah is from the 5 types of grain, so also chodesh is 5 types of grain. Remember, lechem oini taught me that the chiyuv of challah is from a dough that is made of the 5 types of grain, but that lechem oini also teaches me that the iser of chodesh only applies to a bread or to the 5 types of grain. Grapes are not asar because of chodesh. It's only something made of the 5 types of grain. Okay, we'll continue with the Gemara tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem.
Shkoyach Baruch. Thank you.
Gute Nacht, everybody.
Gute Nacht.